And welcome to Assembly Update. I'm Mike Friesen. With us for our program, Assemblyman Andy Goodell. Andy Goodell represents the 150th Assembly District. That includes Chautauqua County. We thank you folks in Western New York for joining us. Happy 2020 to you, Andy Goodell.
Thank you very much.
This is our first chance to sit down and chat this legislative calendar year at the state capitol in Albany. We're going to be talking about all sorts of things of interest to you folks. There's a budget debate that's underway and really coming into full swing here at the state capitol. That'll be tops on our agenda, I'm sure, in future programs. But I want to start with a topic that seems to be front and center no matter what newspaper you pick up around the state, whether it's out of Western New York or even one of the New York City papers. Everybody's talking about this topic that has been called bail reform. The state last year, the legislature, tried to change the way that bail is handled in this state because there are many people who feel that the bail system, the way it had been in the state of New York, was unfair to the poor. In other words, you get charged with a crime, bail gets set. If you can't afford it, you have to stay in prison. But if you can afford it, you're out and walking around. People thought that wasn't fair.
Well, there is a certain unfairness in it, and there's no question about it. But the solution that they came up with, which is a Democrat majority in both houses, signed on by the governor, their solution was to eliminate bail at all, no bail, for over 400 crimes, including several very serious crimes. And so as a result, rather than fine-tune the old system and correct the issues, they just simply eliminated bail for all but the most serious violent crimes. And as a result, in New York State, we now have what's known as catch and release. The police catch someone, almost immediately release them. And then they went one step further. They said if the person doesn't show up for the trial, which is no surprise, there's no bail and nothing at risk, rather than issue a warrant for them to be picked up and brought to court, the court staff are now required to set a new date and send them a courtesy reminder to their last known address. And only if they miss several of those will they issue a warrant to bring them in. Unfortunately, the problem is this catch and release program creates tremendous safety issues for all of our residents in all of our communities and dramatically undercuts our law enforcement efforts. So I've heard the claim that the old system was unfair to the poor because someone who was rich could post bail and walk that afternoon. But that's a very short-sighted view because the money that was posted by the rich for bail is the exact same money that would be used to pay a bounty hunter if that rich person didn't come back. And so when a rich person posted a large bail, it almost guaranteed that the rich person, not just the poor, but the rich person, would see justice. Because if they didn't show up, that money was used to track down the rich person and bring them back. And we've all seen, those TV shows about bounty hunters. Mm-hmm. They were being paid by the bail that was posted by the defendant they were chasing.
That's how they make their money.
That's how they make their money. Mm-hmm. The second thing you want to keep in mind is that the Republican conference sincerely cares about the safety of every community, not just rich communities, but we care about the safety of poor communities too. And when you look at federal victimization data, you realize the likelihood that a person will be a victim of a crime is 3 times higher if their income is below $25,000 than if it's between 50 and 100. So it's the poor that are the largest victims of our criminal justice reform, which lets the criminal back out into their community. 70% of the victims have the same demographic characteristics as the defendant. So if we're serious about protecting everyone, not just rich communities, but poor communities as well, we need to make sure that those people who are preying on innocent victims, who are terrorizing that community, who are engaged in law-breaking activities as a way of life, make sure they show up for court and that they are appropriately punished. Now, to address the concerns that some of the defendant advocates had, that a poor person might be sentenced too long. There's other solutions other than completely eliminating bail. For example, we could have amended the law, and I'm introducing legislation to do this, that would require judges to automatically review the status of any inmate who's there beyond a designated time period. So, for example, if you're sentenced for or arrested for a minor Class A misdemeanor, the judge would be required after 4 to 6 weeks to review your bail to see whether you should still be there, so that we don't run into the situation where a person is in jail waiting for trial longer than they would be in jail if they had pled guilty on day one. The second thing we need to do is use our state resources to develop and expand alternatives to incarceration that protect our communities as well.
Well, that's one of the problems, right? I mean, the prisons are pretty full right now. Some would say too full.
Right. And so there are people that we can release without just letting them go, without catching and releasing. And we can use, for example, the electronic ankle bracelet, so we know where they are, so we guarantee that they're coming back. Or we can release them under supervision of a probation officer, for example, or law enforcement, or a responsible individual. There are other alternatives that guarantee that the person comes back for trial and we protect the community. And so, rather than just eliminate bail and let everyone out on the streets, these other options are a much more balanced approach that ensure that we're fair to defendants while also being fair to our communities.
There's been a lot of talk about the reinstatement of judicial discretion, giving judges the authority to make the decisions in these cases as to what's right, what would be a proper amount of bail, and that sort of thing. But it all comes back down to that same idea, doesn't it? That you could end up with people, just because they're poor and they can't afford the bail, in a different situation than somebody who can afford the bail.
Sure. Upstate, all of our judges are elected. And so when they run for re-election, of course, they have to convince the public that they're the best candidate, that they know the law the best, and that they're the fairest. And so you have a built-in check and balance already on judges. In addition, if a judge does not exercise discretion properly, a defendant can challenge it. There's a process for that to be reviewed. So if you think of one size fits all, no bail at all for 400 crimes, including vehicular manslaughter or almost all of our drug crimes, dealer, you can be a dealer, you're out on the street the same day you're arrested. Instead of taking that one size fits all, having judicial discretion coupled with safeguards along the lines I mentioned, which requires a judge to review anyone who's still incarcerated after a designated time period, with the review process that's already in the program, so it can be reviewed by other judges, I think is the right approach. Now, most judges want to do what's right. There are very few that have anything other than trying to protect the community and do what's right for the defendant. But sometimes they don't realize that they may impose a relatively modest bail, and they may not realize the defendant is still in jail 4 to 6 weeks later because they can't come up with a few $100s for bail. Under the approach I'm suggesting, the reform I'm suggesting, that inmate would then be brought back to that judge so that the judge wouldn't be unaware of the situation, so that the judge, exercising discretion, could then adjust the bail or release them under their own recognizance, or release them under the supervision of probation, or release them with an ankle bracelet. So those are other options which still preserve discretion, but make sure that we protect defendants from serving an inordinate amount of time while waiting trial.
Aren't you, though, and your colleagues who have a problem with this, the way things are set up right now, you kind of fear-mongering? Aren't you kind of cherry-picking the different crimes that you're highlighting here? And yeah, there have been a few instances where maybe it's been too much, but that most of this has to do with lower level crimes that aren't really such a threat to, overall threat to society.
Sure. And of course, there's no doubt that the stories of horrific situations all across New York State, they're occurring every day. I mean, you cannot pick up any statewide newspaper or publication or list without seeing multiple examples. And the examples are horrific. I mean, they arrested nearly 100 MS-13 gang members. Remember a few weeks ago?
Right.
About 70% of them were released with no bail. MS-13 gang members. Yeah, they're back on the streets terrorizing their communities. This last Wednesday, they arrested 5 or 6 members in a multi-million-dollar drug trafficking operation. They had thousands of glassine containers with fentanyl. Processed, released. They caught a bank robber who had held up 4 banks. He was a serial robber. They processed him and released him with no bail. And when he was released, he said to him, I can't believe you guys are releasing me. 4 hours later, they arrested him again for his 5th bank robbery. So yeah, clearly there's a number of serious crimes. Vehicular manslaughter, drunk driver, crashes, kills an innocent person. They're out on the street before the family can even be notified because they've been released. They're actually released before they're sober.
Didn't the state of New Jersey do something similar, though, a couple years ago? And people in New Jersey are okay with this.
But New Jersey phased in their program over a 3-year period, and they spent a considerable amount of money and effort to make sure that alternatives to incarceration were in place. Those same alternatives that I mentioned. Electronic bracelets, for example, so they can monitor where someone is and make sure they come back. They expanded the support staff so they could release them under the supervision of probation, for example. Those alternatives were funded by New Jersey in advance and in place before they moved to start pulling back. Also, they didn't give a blanket waiver like New York State has. Now, in New York City, there are some judges who are very reluctant to release a serious criminal. They would normally order that individual to wear an electronic bracelet. You can't get them. They're not available because New York implemented the system so fast, there was no time or money sufficient to meet the demand for the ankle bracelets. And so it's...
So they have to let them out without.
So they let them out without. They have no choice. And so yeah, New Jersey did something similar. Their program was much narrower, and it was implemented over a multi-year period, and they had the supports and the alternatives in place before it went live.
It seems like it would have been almost an easy thing for the New York State Legislature to kind of look at what their neighbor was doing and say, oh, yeah, this would work, that works. If it's working, adopt something similar to that then, maybe to avoid a lot of this angst that's going on in the state of New York right now.
And what you saw last legislative session was the first time in 10 years the Democrats controlled both the Senate and the Assembly. And they were anxious to prove that they could accomplish a great deal in a short period of time. And so there was a lot of legislation that went flying through without the normal due diligence that you would hope and expect for major legislation. And this is just one example of a piece of major legislation that went through, and it was included in the budget, so it was not a standalone bill. There were inadequate hearings. They didn't take their time, and it was an absolute disaster. Interestingly, this week on the floor of the Assembly, about 2/3 of our bills are correction bills, fixing problems that occurred last year. And this was one of the largest problems.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Some Democratic leaders, the governor, the Senate leader, talking about maybe massaging this, tweaking it a little bit. The Assembly Speaker, though, he seems pretty adamant that he's concerned about the outcome.
The Assembly Speaker is caught in a political rock and a hard place. He's got 25 members who are facing primaries from the far left, and those members don't want to have to vote on this because reeling back this reform would put them at high risk in their primaries. So the Speaker's in a very difficult spot.
And we're out of time. Andy Goodell, thanks as always for joining us. Thank you folks for spending your time. We'll see you soon for our next Assembly Update.